Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to VUS TESOL Webinars 2021. My name is Trung and I'll be your host today. Before we start, can I check if all of you can hear me well? If yes, please type yes in the chat box. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So we're all good to start. This free webinar series is held by VUS with the participation of ELT experts and invited speakers from well-known publishing houses, such as Cambridge Assessment English, Cambridge University Press, eFuture, Maryland Education, Publications, National Geographic Learning, Oxford University Press, StudyCat, and VUS. We hope to bring you the most updated ELT trends and practical teaching methods and techniques so that you can teach your class more effectively. Before we start, I'm so glad to announce the lucky draw winners from Webinar 2, Differentiated Instruction in the English Classroom. How can you do it last Tuesday? So let me share the screen so you can see the names of the winners. Okay. These winners were randomly selected among those who completed the feedback after the webinar. So let me show their names on the screen. Forgive me if I make a mistake in pronouncing your name. So Benjamin N. Avedino, Donan Jabins, Diệu Ngọc Quyên, Trịnh Bình Thanh Sơn, and Trần Quỳnh An. Congratulations. So VUS or the sponsor will contact you for the prize receipts. You will receive the series of the interactive course book from level starters to level 6. Congratulations. So we're pleased to have you all in today's webinars, Assessing Online, Adapting Our Assessment Practices, presented by Mr. Mark Richard from Oxford University Press. And now let me start our webinar today. So please be informed that we will have the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. During that time, I'll send you the links to complete a survey about this webinar and to download your certificate of participation. So let me introduce to you Mr. Mark Richard. Now over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much for that, Tran. Just as Tran's doing, we have to start off by checking. Please, can you type in the chat box, yes, and yes, if you can see me and hear me. Excellent. Good, and now what I'm going to do is share my screen. So a moment, please. Okay, great. So now you should be seeing a slide which says Assessing Online, Adapting Our Assessment Practices. Okay, is that what you see? Excellent. And let me just make sure I can see your chat because I want to see what you talk about. Yes. I see lots of yes and clearly. Okay, great. Well, okay, let's get started. With Assessing Online. Okay, so thank you very much for joining me today. I am Educational Services Manager for Oxford University Press. Right now, I am in my home in Taipei in Taiwan, so it's very nice to be with you today. So let's get started thinking about how we can adapt our assessment practices so that they make sense for teaching online. So this is an overview of this presentation. We have 3 parts. First, we'll think about this question, what does assessment mean? Okay, so once we've understood that term, we'll then start looking at the challenges which we face when assessing online as opposed to face-to-face or in the classroom. So what are those key challenges? That'll be quite brief. And I want to leave at least 25 minutes for the last part, which is possible solutions. So in this final section, possible solutions, what I'll focus on is actually your decision-making process in identifying appropriate solutions for your online assessment needs. And I'll show you some examples of alternative forms of assessment which tend to work very nicely in online environments. Okay, so that's the path we'll take. And let's start by looking at what assessment means. So I'm going to show you a quote here. And the quote is this. Let me read it. I'll just shift my video out of the way. My face is covering the quote. I don't want to see my face. I want to see the quote. So a great teacher is a habitual student of his or her students. So I think this is an interesting quote. And it's when you hear a definition of assessment, you don't often hear definitions like this. But for me, it makes a lot of sense. Because today, when I say assessment, what I'm talking about is not merely tests, although tests are part of assessing our students. But this quote reflects a very, very broad definition of what assessment means, which is doing things to help us understand our students, what they know, how they're learning, what they can do. All right. I also like this quote because what it expresses is why assessment is important. You see, teaching and assessment are not really separate. What this quote is saying is that you cannot separate assessment from teaching, whether it's offline or whether it's online. Assessment is an important part of teaching, and we'll get into that, because assessment in its many forms really is about knowing your students, studying your students and how they're doing, how they're learning, and that's important. If you want to support your students, and that's your role as a teacher, well, you have to know what they know and how well they're learning, where they find challenges, where it might be easy for them. Okay, so you have to keep studying your students, and I define assessment as merely that, right? Studying your students, and for me as a teacher, that helps me to develop. If I never assess my students in the sense of I never get information about how they're doing, how do I know if my teaching is successful? How do I know what to do next in my teaching, how to adjust, how to support my students? And so in a sense, assessment is a part of teaching, and it helps you to gain more satisfaction from teaching. Okay, so by the way, this quote is from Carol Ann Tomlinson, an American educator. So some key points, and in fact, these are assumptions about assessment which underpin this whole presentation and my beliefs on assessment. First, assessment is integral to good teaching. So the two of these, teaching and assessment, they go hand in hand. And anyone who is teaching online, if you're teaching, you're involved in assessing. If you're teaching offline, you're assessing your students offline in some way. If you're teaching online, you are involved in assessing your students online in some way, and there are many ways. Okay, the next assumption underpinning this presentation is this. Every teaching and assessment situation is unique. So I suspect that most of you are teachers and would regard yourselves as experts in teaching more than in assessment, which is quite a specialist area. So just as you will understand that every student, every class you teach, even if it's teaching the same unit from the same course book, it's just different. And different classes just have different dynamics. And you teach different groups of people in different contexts. And then you make decisions about teaching based on those contexts. Well, assessment is the same. Okay, every assessment situation is unique, and the decisions about assessment, how to assess your students, need to be made with an understanding of your students' context. And the best people to understand your students' contexts, that's you, that's the teacher. So teacher's instincts, your gut feeling about what is right for your student, that's very, very important. And it's something that you can feel inside you is important when you're teaching. I'd like to tell you that it's also very important. Your instincts as a teacher are very important in assessing too what's the right way to assess your students. And what's appropriate for one situation, like one class, might not be appropriate for another. What's an appropriate form of assessment face-to-face might not be appropriate for teaching the same students online. Next, no assessment is perfect, whether it's online or offline. So yeah, sometimes you might get worried about choosing a form of assessment, including a test, and you think, well, it just doesn't work very well, or there are issues with it. There are always issues with any assessment method. Any assessment method you choose is a compromise. It's never perfect. Okay, so what's important is to forget about making a perfect decision, but focus on making principled decisions about how you assess your students. And it needs to be principled, because the decisions you make about how to assess your students can have big effects on how they learn and how they feel, their well-being as well. So the key question for this session is this: how can we, as teachers who perhaps are not experts on language assessment, how can we make principled decisions about assessing our students? That's our key question today. And the aim of this presentation is I want to share ideas with you about how to do that. How can we make principled and realistic, pragmatic decisions to assess our students? Okay, so that's some of the kind of big thoughts around what I'm trying to do today. And now it's time for you to do something. You've got a chat box, which I'm going to watch. It's over there for me, okay? And I'm looking at the chat box, and I'd like you to answer this question. Or not really a question, it's a task. Can you please define assessment in one sentence? So time for you to do your dictionary definition of assessment in one sentence, and I shall give you a little bit of time, not too long, maybe a minute, and I'll see your ideas, which are over there for me. So forgive me if I look away from the camera, because that's where I see your responses. So I see Multi-McGee, allow teachers to track the ongoing progress regularly and often. I like that. We've got assessing student learning outcomes through evaluation, evaluate learning skills. I know the chat box is going to sort of go like this, so I'll try and catch. Assessment is testing. Well, I'd say testing is a form of assessment, but assessment is broader. Assessment means to set goals and I think achieve them. Well, a tool to monitor the progress of the student. What's interesting about your responses for me is this: they're all so different, aren't they? All so different. It's really, really hard to define. And so I'm going to work with this definition today, okay, which is this: gathering information. So here's what assessment is. Assessment is gathering information in order to make judgments which provide the basis for action. This definition is taken from this, this paper, right? It's a white paper from Oxford University Press experts. It's effective feedback, the key to successful assessment for learning. You can download it, right, if you want to. And why I am using this definition is because it's a broad definition of assessment. Okay, this is from a position paper, which is Oxford University Press's beliefs, core principles about feedback and assessment for learning. And what this definition does is it doesn't limit assessment to tests. Okay, tests are one way of assessing students, but there are many, many other ways. Assessment is information, any information or anything we do to gather information about what our students know and what they can do. So for example, from this definition, we could say that homework, classwork, courseworks, projects, or you observing students doing a dialogue with each other in class or online. That's getting information about how your students are doing, what they know, what they can do. So that is assessment. Now, a key word in this definition, which you can see on the screen, is action. All right, because it's no good getting lots of information from students about how well they're doing, or or not. What's important is we've got to do something with the information which we have gathered. And so the very first step in making principled decisions about how to assess our students, the very first step, number one thing we do is we determine the purpose of the assessment. In other words, why are we assessing our students? All right, so we've got to understand the purpose. That's the first step. So what are, and I'm going to look at the chat box again, what are some of the purposes for assessing your students? What are some possible purposes of assessments? And that will include tests. Let's take a look at your answers. And there will be many different purposes. Some of them you've already written, learning styles. So one reason you might assess students is to adjust your teaching activities to suit them better or to cater for their needs, evaluate students' progress, see how they've improved, to grade them, to give them a mark, to put them into groups, to know the areas you need to improve on. Again, lots and lots of various answers, and all of them useful, right? Because there are many purposes for assessing students, and that can affect the type of assessment we give. Now, what I'm going to show you next is, in the next slide, is sort of a more detailed breakdown of this. But for the purposes of today's session, what's important is that we're all clear on the two main areas or two main types of assessment. So pretty much all assessments, including tests, will be in one of two categories. The first is formative, and the second is summative. So formative assessment, as you can see on the picture of, hopefully you can see my pointer here. Formative assessment, these students walking up the stairs. Summative, they've reached the top. Okay, so formative assessment is about looking forward, looking ahead. It guides students' next steps in learning. And it's also related to, it's an element of assessment for learning, right? You're assessing students for learning purposes to help them learn. AFL, assessment for learning. Now, the other kind is a summative assessment, right? And summative assessment, you've reached the top of the stairs, okay? And you are looking back, right? You're looking back at what students have achieved and probably giving them some kind of grade. So as you can see at the bottom, although these two seem pretty clearly different, they often overlap. And I'll give you an example of how they might overlap. Now, if you can imagine that you give your students, by the way, can I just check with you something? When you see my slide, do you see the chat box on top of it or just the slide? Because I've kind of got my chat box over the slide. You see both? Oh, okay. All right. That was an accident. Okay. Sorry about that. I thought it would only show you the screen I'd chosen and that I was putting another screen, the chat, on top of it. Okay. Now I've just moved it off so you can only see the slide. That's excellent. I think I need about 5 different screens. Apologies about that, everyone. Now you'll be able to, I wasn't aware of that. It just occurred to me. But now, let's see, let's just check. So you've decided to say, oh, luckily, I don't think you've missed anything. Okay, so here we see summative assessment, formative assessment. You can see the slide. Revealed at last, the mystery. Okay, right. Okay, right, okay. So, yeah, so summative assessment is also known as assessment of learning. What have students learned? So at the bottom of the slide, I've got this point. These two kinds of assessment often overlap, right? Now, one example is if you imagine that you give your students an end of term test or end of semester test, Now, if you simply give the students a grade, right, A, B, C, D, E, then that's a summative assessment. You're measuring where they've gotten to. However, you could give exactly the same test. And if you use their test responses in order to, so that you can give them feedback on how they can improve next term, then that becomes formative assessment, right? And so the point here is that summative and formative assessment are not completely separate methods. It's more a question of what you do with the information that you gather, okay? It's all about what you do with the information which you gather. Do you use the information, you know, to make a sort of summative grade, or formative, giving feedback? Oh, you did this very well, but you could improve this. So next time, please focus on doing this and you'll get better, right? So that's the difference. And if you want to know more about the details, okay, then you can look at this slide and you will see a kind of breakdown. Now, if you want to take a screenshot of this, I'm not going to go through everything because this is more about types of test. But as you can see, there are three main kinds of formative test. They are placement test, a diagnostic test, and a progress test. And the main kind of the summative test is a proficiency test. Okay, and you can see in this chart when you give them, why you give them. In particular, we're focusing on purposes, so I've highlighted why and what they test. Right, I'm not going to go over all of this because this is not a session about testing, right, per se. But I have highlighted in gray diagnostic and progress, and that's what I kind of want to focus on from now on, right, is because placement tests, proficiency tests, it's not really something that are given or done by teachers. I want to focus on forms of tests which teachers kind of handle. So diagnostic tests help teachers to identify student strengths and weaknesses, so that can inform your teaching. And in particular, progress tests are the most common kind of assessment, I would say. A test is a kind of assessment, and they're taken at various stages of the course, end of the unit test, that kind of thing. They are usually delivered by teachers, and they're taken to inform learning and to provide evidence of learning to students and parents and managers at your school. So I'm going to focus on progress tests because that's probably the area with the biggest impact on teachers. All right. Okay. So that's the introduction done. We've covered kinds of what is an assessment, what are the purposes. Now we understand that tests are a inside assessment. Tests are a form of assessment, but there are other ways of assessing too. Anything you do to gather information from your students, that's an assessment. Okay, so in fact, I could use this chat box. If I asked you, oh, what do you think? Just by seeing your answers, it's giving me an idea of your level of understanding around testing and summative assessment, testing, assessments, summative, right? So I can see you've got a pretty strong idea already, and I can adjust my delivery because of that. And if there was something you clearly weren't, no one was typing, I think maybe I can go over that again. Okay, so this chat box is a form of assessment in a way. It's giving me information about you. So let's now focus on, the challenges of online assessment. So we'll do this, let's see, quite quickly, because I want to focus more on the final section. So what challenges have you, this is another chat box task for everyone out there. What challenges have you encountered, or do you imagine that you might encounter when assessing students online? So we've got internet connection, hard to assess listening, students can't interact, cheating, internet problems, plagiarizing. Isolation is a very interesting one from, I didn't catch your name. Internet, someone says, behaviors of students, lots, weak connection, technical difficulties. Yeah, that's many, right? So let's go over some challenges. All right. And I think the key point I'd like to make here is that there are many challenges, and to be honest with you, we can't really overcome them all 100%. So let's take a look at technology. So many of you in the chat box have mentioned challenges to do with technology, right? So first thing, well, yeah, internet connection. Okay, if it's not reliable, then especially quite formal tests, summative tests, becomes somewhat unfair if students have different internet speeds or connection speeds. You've also got devices. So students and teachers need access to appropriate devices with a good internet connection. And students may be using different devices. Okay, so what if one student's using, if it's a writing assignment, one student's using a nice keyboard, you know, a laptop, another's got a laptop with a keyboard, one's using their phone. Well, that's not fair, is it? If it's like a very formal test, which is going to, you know, give the students a grade, that might not be fair. So technology, oh, and students may have different digital skills. So if a student has higher digital skills, you know, they're almost, or if a student has lower digital skills, it doesn't mean their English is worse. Maybe it's just their digital skills are getting in the way. So these are some challenges of assessing online around technology. Next, let's take a look at cheating, which several of you mentioned. So this is obviously a widespread concern. It generally is more difficult to prevent cheating when you're assessing remotely. Now, you have to think about what cheating means. So what is cheating, right? Is getting help from other people, like an older brother or sister, is that cheating? Is plagiarism cheating? What about using dictionaries or, you know, Google to search something on the internet? Is that cheating? Getting someone else to do the work, is that cheating? Some of you are saying no, yes, all of them, sure. Well, it depends, right? It depends on the criteria. So this is the thing is, you might actually online decide that, you know, it's fine for students to do work where they look up an online dictionary. Okay, so you might actually try to redefine what cheating is compared to, because online, how do you know if a student's looking up? You don't know if I'm looking at a book, do you? And just reading everything from a book I have like down here about online assessments. You just can't see it. So maybe you'll say, yeah, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. So you might have to redefine cheating, but clearly some things are just wrong, okay? And whatever form it takes, here's the thing about cheating. For actual tests where you get a grade, cheating isn't fair, but from a perspective of formative assessment for learning, right? Formative assessment, the problem with cheating is this: it stops the teacher from getting an accurate picture of students' abilities. So how can you give them helpful feedback if you're not getting accurate data from your students? And remember, assessment is about gathering information from your students about what they can do, what they know, and then taking action based on it. So the problem with cheating from that perspective is your data is no good. All right. Now, the third box on the top right is supporting students. So yeah, particularly kind of pastoral support, which means taking care of your students' emotions. If you see there's a student in the classroom, a student's a bit sad one day, or a student's anxious, you might do something to make them smile, take away their stress, right? We call it pastoral, or yeah, moral support, emotional support, pastoral support. That's usually much more difficult online, right? And also assessments, especially tests, they make students anxious anyway. Added to this, students will be worried about internet connection, device failures, not understanding what to do. Maybe your students don't have a quiet, private place to do the assessment, and there are other challenges in their lives, right? I mean, I'm having to lock my daughter out of my room. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and luckily there's someone to look after her. But yeah, I'm at home because of COVID-19. And yeah, I wouldn't want to do an assessment now because it's tough, right? So you have to factor this into decisions about how to assess students, especially when if your students are online, they're isolated from each other because of COVID, and the situation's ongoing. You might not know at this stage if you'll be teaching in class in September, October, or online. But yeah, I think if a test really makes your students anxious, that's a good enough reason to think, let's not do it, right? Or let's try something which will cause less anxiety. And then the fourth challenge of online assessment is interacting with students. Now, this is particularly relevant to formative or continuous assessment for learning. And for assessment for learning, I mean, one of the most common ways which you get feedback from your students is just being in the classroom with them and seeing if on their faces if they get it, if they're doing a dialogue with each other. You can hear how well they're learning, say listening, well, speaking skills, things like that. And so that's how you gather data. If you try and do the same online, it is more awkward, right? Because you don't get that interaction with students to check, like concept checking. It's more difficult to observe students. You can do it in breakout rooms, but it's more difficult, right? It's more awkward to interact online than in a physical classroom. So the big point from this interacting with students, this point, is online, we need to think about finding some other ways to gather data, to gather information for students so we can assess them well and appropriately and then take action on that. Okay, so those are the challenges, and that's good enough, right? Because I want to now, excellent, I have about like 25 minutes left to look at possible solutions. And I've mentioned this before, I'll say it again. Some of the challenges of online assessment, in fact, I don't think there are any 100% proof solutions which are guaranteed to work in all situations, all right? So the aim of this section is to take a look at questions you should ask. It's about a thinking process. What questions can you ask in order to find an appropriate solution for you, bearing in mind these challenges that we've mentioned? So it's kind of like a thinking process to guide you to select appropriate assessments. So let's move on. So the first question to ask yourself is this: do you assess your students online, or do you decide, nah, the challenges are too great, they're impossible to overcome, let's avoid assessment online? So I'm looking at the chat box now. Are you going to say yes or no? Do you, so imagine, see, I'm not quite sure what your situation is, but imagine you're, COVID-19, no vaccines yet, Delta plus variant all across Vietnam. So you still want to assess your students. Okay, so may I ask you now, definitely yes. Why? I would like to see reasons. Why do you think it's important? And this is my next question. Why do you think it's important to keep on assessing students when you're teaching online? Of course, someone says. And as I look for your answers, we have to adapt. I'll take a sip of water. Right, so we've got motivation to know students' capacity, important to assess them to know whether they understood. Yeah, okay. So interestingly, every comment you're making in the chat box now about assessing students online, you might make exactly the same comments, couldn't you, about assessing students face-to-face, right? There's nothing particularly kind of online about what you're saying, and that makes sense. So it probably is important to keep assessing students online. And here are some key reasons. As we've said before, it's integral. Assessment is integral to teaching and learning. Effective teaching relies on finding out what students know and what they can do. So it's still important when teaching online, right? The second point, it's expected of us. Okay, it is expected. So maybe it's your school, Ministry of Education, parents of students, if they're primary students, the students themselves expect to be assessed. Also, it's a part of a teacher's job to assess, or at least provide evidence. Yeah, provide evidence of what students have achieved. And if you teach primary age students, their parents will want to know how their child is doing. Third point, it maintains normality. So what this means is that if you move from face-to-face to online, it can be quite reassuring. You know, if you normally do assessment, including tests face-to-face, yeah, keep doing them online because it provides a kind of continuation, and that helps everything to feel normal and can take away some stress. This does not necessarily mean that we keep assessing students in exactly the same way. That we may need to consider different methods of assessing for online. We might need to adjust our expectations. Okay, but it can help to maintain more normality. And fourth, it boosts motivation. So one of you in the comments said something about motivation. I saw that word pop up, and that's great. Thank you for that. Because yeah, if you're learning something, and we've all been students, it's nice to have something to work towards, isn't it? And once you've worked hard, a sense of what you've achieved and how far you've come. This applies to students. It also applies to teachers. You want to see what your students have achieved, partially thanks to your hard work as a teacher. All right, so there is a motivational aspect here. So, okay, let's move on to the next question, which is this. So you've either decided that no, you don't want to assess students online because it's very problematic. But most of you have said, yes, you want to keep assessing students. So then the next question is, you need a good kind of assessment, right? So if you're saying yes, then next is this. You need to identify a good online assessment method. So here's what does good mean? So that's the question for you. Again, in the chat boxes, can you answer this question, or just type a few words? What is a good online assessment method? What does good mean when we're thinking about assessment methods? Can you define good? So Andrew Duenas says, easy interface, very clear how to interact with the assessment, effective, user-friendly, effective, suitable, clear in capitals, reliable, valid, says Kate Bam, which is you've used the term valid, which is very core to more formal testing. Right, so awful lot engaging. Again, all great answers, accurate, consistent, repeatable. Some of your answers are more about engagement, access, and some of them are kind of more hardcore test answers about reliability and validity. So let's have a look about what we mean by good in terms of an online assessment. So this slide, I'm going to do this kind of quickly because you could spend hours talking about testing. That's not really my focus. But briefly, the first one, validity and reliability, they tend to be put together because they tend to work in conjunction with each other. And it's really complex, but generally an assessment is valid if it measures the ability you want it to measure, right? And it's reliable if it gives consistent results. So if a student does a test, one day and then next week they do the same test, they should get a very similar score. If they get very different scores, well, maybe they had a bad day, but maybe the test is not reliable, right, in terms of consistent results. So clearly it's important, but there are other aspects to consider. Another one is authenticity. So this means, does the assessment reflect how students will or currently do use the language in real life? So, what are students doing in the assessment? How similar is this to the ways they need to use English in the real world? Okay, then we have impact. So we can talk about, will the assessment help students to learn, right? And that's an important part of assessment, right? And also well-being. Will there be an impact on the students' well-being? And if it causes too much stress and anxiety, you might decide not to use it, and it's not suitable online. Okay, and again, the point that an assessment method which is impactful and suitable offline, face-to-face, might not be suitable online. And then the fourth point is practicality, which is just as important as the other three, because you can only use an assessment, including a test, if you've got enough time, if you've got resources, and that includes digital resources, technology, Wi-Fi or internet, right? Digital skills. So we have to be realistic. Okay, so this slide is a real oversimplification. And if you want to know more, particularly, well, about all of these terms, you can read about them in this focus paper, right? So I'll give you a link to this later. It's called Assessing Learning Online, and it just goes into those sort of aspects in more depth, but it's better to kind of read about those things, I think, than present on them. Okay, so I will share a link if you want to find out more about those kind of aspects, particularly of testing. I'll share that at the end of this session. Okay, let's move on, because you know, we're talking about good assessment, and all of these aspects are very, very important, including impact, including practicality. Now, important for you to understand is that when you choose an assessment, you're kind of looking to balance all four of these aspects, right? And also, you'll find it's a trade-off. Every assessment method is a compromise. So, for example, okay, let's take a multiple choice test. That might be very reliable, which means every teacher can mark it consistently, right? And it's fair for all students, very consistent. But it might be reliable, but it doesn't mean it's valid. Like if you're using a multiple choice test to assess speaking skills, but it's a written multiple choice test, that's not really valid. It's not very authentic, because you'd never do that in real life. Okay, so every assessment method you choose, it's not perfect. Therefore, it's a principled compromise between generally these four elements. Okay, and again, what a good offline assessment might be a bad online assessment. So we have to bear these in mind. Okay. So you've all said you want. So do you use tests, right? So should we use tests online? And I'm talking about when now, before I was asking you, should we use assessments online? You said yes. Now I'm going to narrow it down to tests. And to clarify what I mean by tests, I mean any kind of short-timed test carried out under very controlled conditions, such as you're not allowed to look at dictionaries, right? Yeah, you're going to use tests online. Okay. In that case, you've got to think about particularly challenges and solutions for online tests. So let's go through them. All right, there's no time to kind of ask you. If you want to do tests online, you have to be aware of some challenges, and you can't overcome them all. You just can't. There are no perfect solutions. So first, you've got reliance on technology, which you can see here. It's a big issue if you're doing tests on time. There's no guarantee that students' Wi-Fi's or your Wi-Fi's or internet won't fail during an exam. Okay, there's no guarantee. So it's really, really important, especially for a formal test where you're going to give students a grade, that you have clear procedures for tech breakdowns or failures. For example, if you're doing a speaking exam, if anyone loses internet connection for 30 seconds or more, terminate the test and you retake it later, and that means you've also got to have opportunities for retakes, including alternative versions of the tests. So you can't just give a test online and keep your fingers crossed that the tech works. You've got to have backup procedures. Next, cheating. Again, No simple solution. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you may want to reconsider what you mean by cheating. So instead of banning the use of online dictionaries, maybe you build these skills into the test, right? Why not? You're adapting. But clearly, you know, some cheating is just never acceptable. So one option is surveillance. You could ask students to do a test with their webcams or mobile phones on, so they are being watched. But there are problems with this. It's not foolproof. Generally, students who want to cheat will find a way. And perhaps the more important problem is that you're eroding trust. You're basically saying, I don't trust you, right, to the student. And that could be counterproductive and weaken the rapport you have with your students. So a better option is to maybe cultivate trust. There's an honor code. I'll show you that on the next slide. And it's talk about how important it is not to cheat and have a kind of code of honor in which students will understand why they're going to work alone and follow the rules. And the final point about cheating is talk about your students about the purposes, the benefits, the ethics of assessment, right? Make sure they understand why, what they're doing in terms of assessment and why. Okay, so I said I'd show you an example of an honor code, and this might be a better solution than keeping the students' webcams on them, right? You can see the example here. On my honor, I have neither given nor received aid in completing this assignment. Okay, so if you get students to all buy into that, they're less likely to cheat, right? Some schools will get students to sign a contract. And there is psychological research that when you put your name to paper and sign something, you're much more likely to follow that behavior. Okay, then we have learner anxiety. So tests online can be really anxiety inducing. So you need to ensure that students understand what to do and they have opportunities to practice and to ask you questions. But it still remains a problem. And finally, authenticity, which I just include generally with no specific words. Yeah, any tests, whether online or offline, particularly written tests, they're often not very authentic compared to other methods of assessment. For example, a timed essay. If you give your students 30 minutes to write something, a timed essay, they're not allowed to look up a dictionary or refer to books or the internet. That's something that you would never really have to do in real life. Same with multiple choice tests, right? They're not really authentic. So you can try to make the test tasks resemble real life tasks as much as possible, but still it's a problem. So the big conclusion here is this, to this mini section. Online tests, you can use them, but they pose a number of quite serious problems. They are mostly flawed, right? And I don't think any of these problems can be overcome entirely, right? And so, with that in mind, what can we do, right? And so the next question is this, and I mentioned, this section is all about a thinking process to make principled decisions about choosing assessments for your students. So would you still use online tests? I suspect you would say yes, but you'd use tests? Yes, I'd use tests. Sorry, I've got this screen. Would you use tests? My mouse was on my other screen, apologies. Yes, but would you only use tests? So can you answer to this question here? Would you only use tests or would you consider other forms of assessment too? No, no, no. Right, so, I think I led you to the answer somewhat, but the point is this. If you only use tests, as opposed to this, combining tests with alternative assessment methods, then you're really limiting the information you get from your students. Given that tests online are problematic, students can cheat and so on, right? Well, okay, let's go over your options. Option 1, use tests, no. All right. And then option 2, yes, but I'll only use tests. That's my only form of assessment online. Okay. So, whoops, if you only use tests, Well, maybe you're not getting that much information from your students, or it's not very reliable. The data you are getting from your students might be flawed because of the problems we've looked at. And so option 3 is to combine tests with alternative assessment methods. And this gives you a richer, broader picture of your students' abilities, like a greater representation or sample of what your students can do. Okay. Also, it's useful because if you are only relying on online tests as your only form of assessment, you need something to check against that, right? Because if you also use alternative assessment methods, you can see that there might be some test scores from students which don't make sense. They get a really good test score, but you use alternative assessment methods in which the students are weaker. You need alternative assessment methods to kind of check that the tests are working and the marks are making sense, the feedback. Right, so alternative assessment methods are useful either to replace tests or to supplement them. And so what I'm going to do now is take 5 or 10 minutes to go through different kinds of alternative assessment methods. So first, we have audio and video recordings. So these are useful for speaking assessments. Students can make them using their phone or a tablet or a computer. Second, we have e-portfolios, which are digital collections of students' best work, which students select themselves and they reflect on that work. Third is coursework. So courseworks are longer assignments like essays, projects. Fourth are open book tests. Now, open book tests are kind of between coursework and traditional tests. What happens is you give students, say, 48 hours or 72 hours or something to complete a task. And their students are allowed to use dictionaries and other resources. Okay, so it's a bit more pragmatic, especially for online testing when you can't check what they're doing. And then we have collaborative projects, using Google Docs or something. Students work together and it's easy to track each student's individual contribution to the project. Okay, so these methods enable you to get more information, right, from your students, and also sometimes track and record their answers. They also allow you to assess a broader range of skills, including 21st century skills or global skills, digital literacy, and so on. Now, you might think that, all right, well, I'll tell you what, let's have a look at an example. So audio, video recordings could be a discussion, a role play, and so on. Students can do them themselves or work in groups. And it can develop digital literacy, global or 21st century skills. So I'm going to show you an example here, right? And by the way, I mean, when I give you a link to a handout at the end, it'll list you all sorts of apps that you can use and students can use to make videos or screencasts or things like that. So let's look at this video, and to set it up. So this is an actual student who's Spanish, and they have made a kind of video. It's like a commentary on an image, actually. And what the student needs to do in this task is to choose a photo of a place, describe the photo and the place, and then say why they have chosen it. Okay, so let me play this.
I have chosen a photo of Santander, Spain, with a view of Cabo Menor, which is the cape that you can see in the central part of the image. And just at the back we can see El Sardinero, which is a popular beach in this city. I have chosen this photo because Santander is my hometown, and this view reminds me of my summer holidays when I was a kid.
Okay, there you go. So you can see the students recorded something, so you can assess speaking skills and other aspects as well. Someone asked about global skills. I'll give you a link at the end. Okay, so I mean, this video is recorded by an advanced student, but you could make the task suitable for lower levels too. Now, some people will argue, but the thing about video recordings is the student can re-record again and again and again and again and again until they get their best version. And is that a problem? I would say no, that's actually fantastic, because if the student has decided to re-record their video, what it means is that they've looked at their first effort and decided that it's not good enough and they can improve. And actually, the student's engaging in a form of self-assessment. Okay, so, you know, there's lots to do there. Next, e-portfolios. So it's similar to a paper-based portfolio. Students bring together samples of their best work. They select it, also some kind of reflection on their work. So to be able to assess their best work, students need to engage with assessment criteria. They need to see what the assessment criteria are and understand it, and then choose which of their work fits that the best. Okay, so it's a powerful way to help students to understand assessment criteria for different tasks and get them to practice applying them to their own work. That's a really important skill in academia or, you know, further studies. So let's have a look. Easy to share, by the way, and so let's have a look at an example from the same student. So here you see an example created in Google Sites. So Google Sites, you can use others, like, but you know, it offers a portfolio kind of template students can use. Here, this is the home page in editing mode. So you can see there are menus here. The student can add in text or images or other forms of media and so on. And yeah, the student is a welcome message to their site. Okay, and then if you go in, this is what page 1 looks like. Oh, this is when you publish it. So the students published it, and if I read it as a teacher, this is what I see. So this can be shared with other students too. Okay, the next page could be about the students' learning goals. Why are they learning English? What are their strengths? What are their areas to develop their goals? Now, this is an advanced student, as I've mentioned, but you can imagine you can make this easier for lower level students by, for example, my grammar, choose, needs some work, needs a little work. Yeah, needs lots of work, needs a little work. Okay, pretty good, really good. Students can kind of check boxes if you want to make it suitable for lower level students and so on. Okay, let's see. Students can also upload other work, like a story here, and importantly, it's followed by a reflection. What I did well, what I could improve next time. So this is students engaging in self-assessment and how they will do that. And of course, it's not just written work. You can upload videos, audio recordings, slide presentations, any kind of digital file. Okay, so you can use these methods to actually give students a grade, right? So you're not just relying on tests, but for formative and continuous assessment, you can also use these methods to give them feedback, along with interaction with students online. I mean, observation of classwork. This is easier face-to-face, right? So you may want to, but you can observe students online too. You can also give them feedback and see how they're doing from their homework tasks. If you use Quizlet and those kind of quiz apps, Socrative, Kahoot. And then the last thing I'd say is micro-writing. So micro-writing is when students just write a sentence or a few questions. For example, if students are doing text messages or typing into chat boxes or typing into discussion forums, that all comes under the umbrella of micro-writing. You probably wouldn't give students a mark, but it can be a really good way of seeing how students are doing, how well they're learning. Looking at micro-writing helps to compensate for the difficulties of not being able to interact and observe students so well online. Okay, so you can use chat boxes, post-it boards like Padlet. You can record information for future reference. You can do it in a lesson, before a lesson, after a lesson. So this kind of micro-writing, for example, in Padlet, right? Students, what for you was the most important point raised in this presentation? Why? Students type something, that gives you information on how well the student's doing, right? And it's also getting them to reflect as well. So it's a useful information for formative assessment. Okay, so I'm looking at, it's actually 5 o'clock. So we've covered what assessment is. We've covered the challenges of online assessment and some possible solutions. And just to go over the key messages. And what I'll start doing now is looking at your questions that you've asked me. But as those kind of come in, Q&A, okay, I'm just going to go over key messages. So assessment is a part of effective teaching. You got to know how the students are doing, all right, but not necessarily in the same way as face-to-face. Every assessment is a compromise, right? So don't worry about making a perfect decision. Think about how to make a principled decision. Third point, practicality and impact are important. If an assessment method is not practical or has a negative impact in terms of too much stress, maybe you choose a different approach. And then the fourth point is combine different methods, tests, and various forms of alternative assessment. Any online assessment method presents challenges, especially tests. Okay, so the more information you can gather about your students from different sources, the richer, the more accurate, the more accurately you can assess their abilities, and then you can take informed action as a teacher. All right, so language assessment is really complex, but just remember, keep these principles in mind. Gather as much information about your students as possible in various ways. Trust your instincts about your students and their contexts. Okay, now I'm going to answer some questions now, but if you would like to learn more about assessing learning online, here is the, I'll tell you what, this, you can see the QR code here. And if you would like, at the end of the session, I can paste the URL, and that tells you in more detail. So I'll leave that up there. And I'm going to answer some of your questions. I'm just dragging them across. So let's see. Oh, so I've got a thank you more than a question. So thank you, Sunny. Big scale class of student with different levels. Oh, what's a solution for a successful formative assessment? Right, so there's no one solution, right? People, there is no one easy solution. Every situation is different. So what I've tried to do is, I think it would be almost wrong of me to say, here's an answer which will definitely work for you. What I want to do is provide you with a thinking process to help you make principled decisions. Okay, so another question from Saron. How can a teacher praise students for their correct answers online? Well, yeah, praise is important as a part of feedback. So you can, I mean, it ranges from discussion boards of you know, a smiley or a like, but also I think what's important is saying a bit more than, hey, great, well done. So feedback is really important. And successful feedback lets the student know what to do next to improve. So if you say, oh, well done, your writing was okay, but you know, try a bit harder next time, that's not very useful. So be specific. Well done, I can see that you've concentrated more on your use of tenses today, or in this assignment, and that's good to see. Next time, try to use a greater variety of adjectives to bring your description to life. So be specific. If you really want to help students progress, think about giving 1 or 2 suggestions for how your student can improve. Okay, next, what can we do? This is from Tree. What can we do if students deserved a bad score or a fail mark when we assess them online? If they deserved a bad score, then you give them a bad score, all right? But you tell them why they got a bad score and 1 or 2 things to do to get a better score next time. Don't feel guilty, right? Although perhaps there's something in your question which I'm not kind of inferring about. Yeah, you do have to check that. Why did they get a bad mark? You might want to investigate whether it's because of internet problems or their English. This, guys, is why you need more forms of assessment. If you only have tests, you only get marks back, and you don't know why the student got a bad mark. Was it the internet or was it their English? Where if they got a good mark, were they cheating? That's why you need more informal alternative forms of assessment, so you get a feel, right, for what those bad scores or good scores mean. And can I give you a quintessence of summative and formative assessment? I'll tell you what, maybe I can't right now, but I know someone who can. It's this that you see on the screen. Thank you for those questions, really good questions. download this and it will give you a definition, which is better than I can deliver now, of summative and formative assessment. Okay, and so what you'll do if you go to this website, and I can't see my chat box now because I've got too many things on the screen, but I'll paste this in a minute. Go to this site, scroll down, past position papers. Oh, someone asked about global skills. Near the top, there's a position paper, which are very long kind of academic papers about global skills. So if you're asking about what global skills mean, download that paper. But for this session, go down to the bottom and there are focus papers, which are 5 or 6 pages long, right, with more practical ideas to help you. And there's one called Assessing Online Learning. All right. And it's near the bottom, and so you can just download that. It's free. If you're not a member of the Oxford Teachers Club, you'll be asked to join. It's all free, okay? And you can get that and look at other focus papers we have to support teachers. If you're a teacher trainer, look at the back of focus papers for more videos, okay? And also, which I find useful for teacher trainers, discussion talking points, discussion questions, which you can discuss with teachers if you're tutoring them, right, or nurturing their progress. As educators, here are my references. You'll be sent a PDF, so you can see my references in the PDF. And I would just like to say thank you very, very much, everyone. So thank you, everyone. And Tran, please feel free to come back in now.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mark Richard. Thank you all. We hope that you enjoy our webinar today and will be able to apply the ideas to your teaching practice.
VUS, your English, your future.